Hi again, everyone. This is Martin Boyle, the Understanding British Foreign and Domestic Policymaking Processes course at Boston University in London. And today we're going to be looking at soft power and the role of the media in UK policymaking. So I'm going to be covering a few things today. We'll kick off with a look at some newspaper front pages. We'll look at a few cultural issues around that and how power is deployed. We'll then move on to look at the UK mainstream media in the form of print media, that is newspapers, and think about what is alternative media in that respect and what constitutes fake news. We'll then move on to look at a couple of media models, the pluralist model and a more power-based and coercive model. We'll then move on to look at the concept of soft power and how soft power plays out in UK policy. And we'll finish with a look at the case of Wikipedia and Julian Assange and think about whose power and interests are at play here and how it relates to, the way in which the media may or may not influence UK policy making. So let's do this. First off, have a look at these front pages from a popular tabloid newspaper and just have a think about who the audience is, what the message is, and what the purpose of that message is. Okay, so the one on the left is Up Yours Delors. This was a very famous headline from the late 1980s, notorious headline in The Sun, which was attacking Jacques Delors, who we've already looked at in a different session, who was the head of the European Commission, attacking him for his ECU, which was the European Currency Union unit that was being proposed at the time, the forerunner of the euro. And of course, Britain was very Eurosceptic. This newspaper in, at the time was especially Eurosceptic. Sections of the Conservative Party in particular were very Eurosceptic. The Labour Party wasn't, and a lot of Labour supporters at this time had swung towards the EU as a way of resisting Thatcher in Britain. But yeah, Jacques Delors is the European bogeyman here. You've got the two-fingered V sign, the two-fingered flip, if you like, which is an obscene gesture, only used in England, perhaps in Australia as well, possibly Australia and New Zealand as well. And it's, an obscene gesture which is intended to insult Jacques Delors. So we can see significant amount of patriotism and nationalism here, anti-Europeanism, and this idea that we will not be told what to do by Brussels. We are masters of our own house. So this, this was a famous headline from the late 1980s, which has lasted in the popular consciousness in Britain for a long time ever since then. And it's kind of become a standing sort of running joke, typifying the Sun newspaper's irreverent approach to journalism. After Brexit, of course, in the aftermath and the fallout of the Brexit vote, this headline was reprised in a different way. And on the right here, you can see up your señors. Well, of course, if you speak Spanish, you'll see straight away that the spelling of señores is wrong, but that doesn't matter. It rhymes with yours, just as Delors in English pronunciation rhymes with yours. And this, of course, linguistically is articulating and re-emphasizing Englishness as opposed to Europeanness and French and Spanishness, if you like. And this was reprised in the context of disagreement around the British colony of Gibraltar on the southern tip of Spain, and the message is, Spain, get out of our business. Yeah, don't, we control Gibraltar, we run Gibraltar, and the EU and Spain has no right to tell Britain what to do in Gibraltar. So again, the same approach, the same kind of message, and the audience of The Sun is generally working class, not educated in the sense that they are not the Sun readers are generally not university educated. Now, that does not mean that they are less intelligent, of course. It simply means that they are not university educated. They are more likely to be in manual or unskilled working class jobs, and not members of the middle class or the upper class. So it's there's certainly a message to the British people in these headlines. So what we want to think about really is, how does power operate here, and what kind of power is operating through these headlines, and whose power is it? I'd like you to consider this news report. Twitter has stated the suspension is final, and its rules on platform manipulation apply to users who artificially amplify or suppress information or engage in behavior that manipulates or disrupts people's experience. Consider that for a few minutes. That's great. So obviously this refers to the banning of Donald Trump, the exclusion of Donald Trump from Twitter, where he was basically kicked off Twitter. The Twitter's argument is that Donald Trump amplified and suppressed information or engaged in behavior that manipulated or disrupted people's experience. Well, you might argue, being devil's advocate perhaps, you might argue, is that not what the press does? Is that not what the media is supposed to do? Is the media, that is all media, not supposed to artificially amplify or suppress information or engage in behavior that manipulates, disrupts people's experience? So some people might argue here, this is a bit like people in glass houses accusing others of, saying people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Let's move on. Here we can see some of the mainstream media in the UK. These are the main newspapers in the UK. And what we have here is an opinion poll showing what the general public perceive these newspapers to be in terms of political persuasion. Not what the newspapers themselves actually are objectively, or how they perceive themselves, or perhaps not what a an academic or a researcher on political communication might say these papers are, but rather how they're perceived by the general public. So we've got The Guardian, and 16% think that it's very left-wing, 30 think it's fairly left-wing, 25 slightly left of centre, and going down to 5% think it's very right-wing. Okay. Going down. The Mirror, yeah, 11% very left-wing, going down. 30 think it's fairly, 26 slightly left-wing. And then The Independent, 4 very, 13 fairly, 26 slightly. And interestingly, 37% have plumped for, perhaps kind of what it says on the tin, The Independent must be in the centre. The fact is that The Guardian is perceived to be, left liberal. It describes itself as the leading liberal voice in the UK media. But of course, having looked at the liberal tradition in previous sessions and having discussed the wide range of liberal ideas contained under that umbrella, that kind of raises the question, what do they actually mean when they say we're the leading liberal voice? Do they mean that they are socially liberal? Do they mean they're economically liberal? Do they mean they're neoliberal? What kind of liberal are they? And there is the debate in the UK about, the position of The Guardian in this regard. At one time it was considered, substantially and certainly, social democratic, veering towards socialist left, and certainly very, very opposed to Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism. So it was very socially liberal, and traditionally Labour in many respects as well. That seems to have changed since 2014, and it is often seen as having moved rightwards to the centre, and having adopted an interesting blend of social liberalism and neoliberalism, alongside a support for certain aspects of British foreign policy as they relate to China and Russia in particular, but from a socially liberal perspective, so with an emphasis on human rights, equality, minority rights, multiculturalism, generally what might be termed wokeness, and what other sectors of the left might term woke capitalism. The Guardian refutes this and says that it is a heterogeneous vehicle for liberal ideas, and that it publishes op-eds from all sides of the political spectrum. So at the moment, we could say that that's up for grabs. That argument, that's up for discussion. The Daily Mirror, which is now called simply The Mirror, is a more tabloid left-wing newspaper. It's similar to The Sun in many respects, in that it takes a tabloid approach. It's not as extreme as The Sun, and it's most definitely on the left and not on the right. It's mostly read by old Labour, older people who've come up through the post-war consensus, maybe people who had secure working class jobs in the past. The Independent, it's very, very, very similar to The Guardian in its editorial position and its approach. An interesting way really to get a newspaper's position is just to read the editorials over a period. The editorials generally give the papers a much more accessible way of gauging the newspaper's opinion. The Times, of course, the Thunderer, the old traditional conservative establishment newspaper, is, certainly centre-right and conservative, liberal in an economic sense, of course, and also in a traditional classical liberal way. The Telegraph is a more right-wing, conservative, Middle England quality newspaper, a right-wing riposte to The Guardian, if you like. It is suspicious of what it calls wokeness. It is suspicious of progressive causes and so forth. But in a sense, it's fully behind the British government in terms of its foreign policy with regard to China and Russia. With some caveats, it can be quite critical as well, and we can look at this later. The Sun, as we've seen before, is right wing and a tabloid. The Daily Express and the Daily Mail, definitely right wing, as in centre right conservative, veering towards some of the more prejudiced and bigoted views in British society, xenophobia in some regard, class hatred in other regards, class anxiety, and so forth. But it's interesting that during the days of the former Soviet Union, Soviet diplomats in the UK were advised by their government to read the Daily Mail every day because it gave a general overview of how Middle England felt and how the average British person felt. Interestingly, the Daily Mail is read more by women than by men, so there's an interesting sociological aspect to that as well. We're going to move on to look at some media models now. I'm going to present you with two models of how the media works, and this is the first one. It's called the pluralist model. So take a few minutes just to look at and consider this slide. Okay, so the pluralist model fundamentally is a liberal model. It argues that we live in a free world, we live in a free society, we're in a free country, we can do what we want, we've got a choice. Yeah, we don't have to read a newspaper if we don't like it. If we don't like the editorial position, we don't have to read that newspaper. We might choose newspapers that kind of give us what we want and follow our position, but there's a broad range of these newspapers, and we can select and discriminate between them, and we can use our analytical skills and our discriminatory capacities to pick the truth out of multiple sources of information. So the argument is, we're all free to do what we want. We live in a free country. We're not being force-fed. Yeah, there's not just one party organ telling us all what the truth is. It's all out there, and if we've, if we feel like doing it, we can go and find out the truth, and we can, we can select. So power in democratic societies spread out. Yeah, no one's got a monopoly. There's diverse interests. Diversity is the key to this. Content is driven by profit, yes. This model makes no bones about that, but that profit motive is good for consumers, because if a newspaper or a media outlet is not giving consumers what they want, they'll go out of business. So they can't outright lie, and they can't behave in a way that is utterly counter to our, liberal values and, people's moral codes and so on. Yeah. People are active. We engage with these newspapers actively. We're not passive recipients. We're not being manipulated. And fundamentally, we're not being brainwashed. Journalists are not directly controlled by their master. They're not told what to write. Yeah, they are free agents. Okay. The problem, of course, is that all of these arguments themselves can be, each one of them can perhaps be critiqued and knocked down. In an open, free society, those with the most power perhaps are going to prevail. The newspapers that have the most money and the most resources behind them can, achieve a position of dominance over other newspapers because they've got more money. And the argument that journalists are free from direct control perhaps doesn't stand up, because newspaper editors will, edit their pieces, or they will, redact certain information, cut it out, or in extremis, they might simply not employ journalists who are not going to follow the newspaper's editorial line. So that's the pluralist model. It's fundamentally a liberal model for a free society. I'm going to move on here to the propaganda model, which is the opposite of the pluralist model. Same procedure. Have a look at this and consider it, and then we'll go through it. So fundamentally, this is Herman and Chomsky's manufacturing consent model from 1988. It was updated after 9/11 to include the war on terror and how news media responded to the war on terror. But we'll look at its fundamentals here. And Chomsky, of course, Noam Chomsky, the greatest living public intellectual in the United States, a phenomenal figure in terms of his output, particularly his relentless academic and journalistic output, investigating how power works. He's become very much a thorn in the side of the US establishment. So Herman and Chomsky fundamentally found 6 news filters, mainly structural, whereby news organizations control the mechanism to censor the news unofficially. So this is not explicit power. It's a kind of under the surface kind of power. So filter 1, size, ownership and profit orientation. Obviously, money talks. Yeah. Wealthy elites control the major media conglomerates. If you want to come in as a new media outlet, you face huge costs. You might think that this is different in the age of social media. Chomsky and Herman would probably argue this is not the case. We can look at that later. Filter 2 is advertising. Revenue dependency on advertisers biases news towards consumer culture and wealth idolization. So he who pays the piper calls the tune. Newspapers and media organizations rely on advertising revenue, and those advertisers do not want news that is inimical to their interests. Filter 3, sourcing. So elite institutions, experts subsidize the news with objective information presumed to be accurate. So this information comes from putatively authoritative sources, academic sources, expert. The science is a common example of this, isn't it? The science tells us. Experts have pointed to, and then there'll be some kind of research that, if it's followed, has been found to have been funded by a think tank or an organization that is sympathetic to the interests of the news outlet itself. Chomsky himself is meticulous and persistent in tracking down these organizations with a relentlessness that's quite amazing. So one wonders, how at his age now he's able to continue doing it, but certainly he is an expert at tracking down sources for media reports and the interests related to those sources. Number 4 is flack. So filter 4 is flack and the enforcers. This gets the analogies are increasingly mafia-like. Elites produce costly flack to discipline news outlets and left-wing groups. What does that mean? Well, basically, if a left-wing report comes out, this is in the initial sort of model that Chomsky proposed, if say a broadly left-wing critique of capitalist interests is comes out in an article in a newspaper, right-wing think tanks and policy groups and organizations will combine to write letters, to pay researchers to compose reports and evidence that will discredit the report, the original left-wing report, and they will relentlessly attack the left-wing report in Chomsky's model. Filter 5, ideology, the framework that defines boundaries for acceptable ideas and creates unity through a common enemy. In 1988, of course, it was still the Cold War, and the common enemy there was communism. One could argue now that that common enemy is not there now, but it's still China and Russia. It could be authoritarianism, lack of freedom, any political regime that is not liberal democratic. It could be workers' rights, it could be Islam. So, there's a whole range of enemies that can be made into common enemies when ideology is deployed through the media. And finally, the 6th filter, buying out, so deliberate concealment of collusive power relations and routine use of off-the-record sourcing to avoid investigative journalism. The common Marxist critique, and this critique is a kind of Marxist critique. The common Marxist critique of the capitalist media is that journalists are simply paid shills. Even investigative, high-profile journalists working for putatively liberal left news outlets like The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times are simply good cops to the capitalist bad cop. They exist in order to make news palatable to people with progressive ideas and therefore bring them on board, co-opt them, and fool them into accepting the neoliberal capitalist worldview, according to this model. Of course, it works the other way. So if we look at Flack and Enforcer's Filter 4, when Chomsky was writing this, of course, it was left-wing groups. One could argue that, because of the way in which social liberalism and neoliberalism have been combined and wrapped together into one presentation parcel by the liberal democratic state and the capitalist interests, that this means that any kind of criticism of that setup is, discredited and attacked, for example, as racist, as extreme right wing, as fascist, and so on and so forth. And Chomsky's model, brought up to date, would argue that that is another way in which the capitalist elite get the liberal left on board with their agenda. So, in sum, a much more overtly political model, one which is quite in your face, and one which is certainly not the liberal model that the pluralist model presents, and which is in fact highly critical of that model. One phenomenon which the propaganda model updated to the present day points to is the tendency of all mainstream media to converge on a broadly liberal ideology which accepts the neoliberal status quo, which sees Russia and China as a threat to liberal democracy, and in doing so, all of these outlets, even the ones that people consider to be right-wing and conservative, accept progressive social liberal nostrums. So, for example, multiculturalism, BLM, LGBTQ plus, equality and diversity, and other very good, moral, laudable, progressive causes and interests are brought on board in order to create a consensus, in order to create a liberal consensus at the centre. This is what we referred to in a previous session as what Tariq Ali refers to as the extreme centre. Such good progressive interests, which are good in themselves and laudable in themselves, are, capitalists realise, of absolutely no threat to the capitalist status quo and the neoliberal settlement. So they can be safely co-opted into the establishment to create gesture politics, which in themselves consolidate a capitalist form of liberal democracy. The critique of this model, of course, the liberal pluralist critique of this model, is that it's too complex. It seems to be a bit paranoid. Do media owners really have the time and the energy to devote resources to doing all of this? Are they able to concentrate as a group when they all have diverse interests and they're all competing against each other in a free market? How can they be colluding with each other in order to create a common goal? Surely in a free market and an open market, in an open capitalist society, people in competition will not be colluding like this. And this is something that you can consider when you come to write about this. So let's move on to some definitions of how soft power works. Obviously, the kind of power that we've been looking at in the media is not a military power. It's not coercive in the sense that people are being forced explicitly to do something, but power is certainly operative there. So what kind of power is it? Well, Joseph Nye, the American political scientist, first of all talks about hard power as the ability to get others to act in ways that are contrary to their initial preferences and strategies, including through sticks and carrots. So this is hard power. That includes military power, but it can also include boss-worker relations. It can include parents-children, relations, any kind of social relationship where power is operative, can involve hard power. But there's a kind of soft power as well. And Nye says that that's the ability to get others to want the outcomes that you want, and the ability to achieve goals through attraction rather than coercion. So you are attracting people to your cause, to your interests, and in the end they want what you want. This could be perhaps a form of brainwashing, or it could be something a bit more benign than brainwashing, because brainwashing obviously has this implication of mind control and, the Manchurian Candidate, that kind of thing. We must admit, though, of course, that Hollywood works in this kind of way, doesn't it? Some people have said that the reason why, the United States does not, perhaps have the kind of political propaganda language that authoritarian states have is that they have Hollywood to create the language of attraction for them. And this quote at the bottom, it's not necessarily better to twist minds than to twist arms. And this is Nye obviously observing that soft power in itself is not necessarily any nicer than hard power. If I twist your arm, it hurts. If I twist your mind, that's something a bit more insidious and damaging than just twisting your arm. So where does the media fit into soft power? Well, here's a model of soft power, and I'll give you a few minutes just to consider this. There are 7 pillars: business and trade, governance, international relations, culture and heritage, media and communication, science, education and science, people and values. The one that we want to concentrate on here is media and communication. Obviously, there are others. So, for example, the US will use not just its media and communications, but it'll use music, it'll use Hollywood, the Peace Corps, and its media and communications might be, Voice of America, for example. Similarly with Britain, media and communications would be the BBC, but Britain, project soft power in other ways, and this is explicit in its policy, in its foreign policy making, through organisations like the British Council, through the Ministry of Digital Culture and Sport. So Britain has an explicitly stated soft power agenda, and you'll see that in the case study as you read that documentation around global Britain. So media and communication, traditional media, social media and marketing, and Britain is pretty good at these things. I mean, Britain's got a wide range of media. The BBC is famous. The BBC World Service is famous. It's praised and lauded for its impartiality and its accurate reporting. Whether it is impartial or not, again, this can be critiqued, and a lot of people do challenge the BBC's impartiality. It is, it does have a relationship with government. It's not government owned. It's run under a royal charter like universities, but there is, government funding there. So we've got traditional media, TV, newspapers and so on, and then there's social media and the internet, and again, all traditional media are on the internet as well. And then there's marketing, and Britain is a master at marketing its image. We've got global Britain. At the turn of the century, we had we had Cool Britannia, we had the Olympics in 2012. So Britain is a master at selling itself worldwide using the soft power attraction of its culture, London, music, film, advertising, fashion, and so on and so forth. And here is an academic model, a recent academic model of how UK soft power is projected. I'll give you a few minutes to just consider this. So you can see a whole range of social, cultural, diplomatic, economic, trade-linked, even military efforts and humanitarian efforts to project Britain's soft power through its foreign policy. And it relies on a whole network of interconnected agencies, organisations, public and private institutions, and so on and so forth. And Britain obviously has been developing this for years and years. And we can certainly say that, Britain has a lot of social capital and soft power capital that it can project in the search to fulfill its interests. A crucial question here, of course, is to what extent is Britain's ability to project its soft power a function of liberal democracy and the liberal tradition? Countries that tend to have soft power tend to be liberal democracies. You don't get authoritarian countries that have a high degree of soft power. Okay, in the past, countries like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba had a lot of kudos because of their internationalism, third worldism, supporting anti-colonialism in the developing world, and so on and so forth. Brazil, for example, Brazil is not an authoritarian regime yet. It has been in the past, but it has a degree of soft power, perhaps because of its music, its football, and the attraction of its culture and so on. But generally, it's liberal democracies of the Western kind that have soft power. So Britain has soft power, America has soft power, France has soft power, Sweden's got more soft power than, you know, China, for example. China doesn't have soft power because it's, you know, so the people who are interested in China and Chinese culture tend not to be the vast majority of people. They might be some, you know, academic specialists or something like that. So why is it? Yeah, is it a function of liberal democracy itself? Is it a function of the liberal tradition? And is soft power a function of liberalism? Does that mean that Chinese, Russian, and so on efforts to accrue soft power and to develop soft power programs are ultimately doomed to failure because they don't have soft power in the first place, and perhaps they're trying to manufacture it from scratch, whereas Western democracies don't need to manufacture soft power from scratch. All they need to do is to harness it because it's already there. And they harness it in this way, according to this model, by you know, funneling it and channeling it through a whole range of public and private organizations, perhaps. So finally, what I'd like you to consider going forward is the question of the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. It's said that, you know, liberal democracies don't have political prisoners. Authoritarian regimes do have political prisoners. Authoritarian regimes produce dissidents who oppose that regime and suffer and are imprisoned and may be freed and, you know, come to the West. It's very rarely pointed out, you know, that, you know, you might have political prisoners and dissidents in the West as well. And here's a case in point, Julian Assange and the case of WikiLeaks, the US government's case against him. He's currently imprisoned in Belmarsh prison in near London, a high security prison. You know, what's his situation? He was physically removed from the Ecuadorian embassy where he had claimed political asylum after, you know, a bit of coercion from the US state on Ecuador and a change of president in Ecuador and so on. So how does power work here? How does soft power work? How does hard power work? Whose interests are at play here? I'd like you to do your own research on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and consider how soft power operates here, and, you know, the media models, how they relate to the case of WikiLeaks as well. That's all for today. Thanks very much.